Today we're tackling a project that might seem a bit daunting at first, painting a hutch. But don't worry, we're here to show you it's way easier than you might think. If you've got some old oak furniture lying around that's screaming for a makeover, this one's for you. This hutch was $80 on Marketplace, so we snatched it up to make it pretty again. First, I removed the glass from the two cabinet doors. For this cabinet, the glass was held in with a few hooks screwed on around the door. It was really easy to unscrew the hooks and remove the glass. I'm always nervous when removing the glass because one time I broke it while it was out of a hutch. Hopefully, never again. I also removed the other random hardware pieces for the doors, but I thought I might just paint this piece with the doors on, so I left the hinges on the doors. But I labeled all of the pieces well so I could easily put them back in place when the paint was done. Then I prepped the cabinet for paint. I cleaned it with crud cutter to remove any grease and grime and all of the dust from this cabinet sitting in my garage for months. I also scraped off some lingering tape residue and something else while I was at it. Squeaky clean now. The next day, I thought better of it and removed the hinges and doors from the cabinets so I could paint this properly and not get paint on the hinges. I avoid removing doors if at all possible because sometimes they don't go back on properly. So in the process, I labeled the hardware very well so everything would go back in the same place as before. Then I got stuck picking a paint color. I swear, this is almost the worst part of any DIY project. I have quite a bit of paint on hand and I'm trying to use it all up. But I was nervous that a project of this size would take a lot of paint. So I gathered some General Finishes milk paint and tried mixing some of the colors together to create a new color with the remnants. I really only had a few shades of blue and gray to choose from, so I mixed different combinations together, put them on paint sticks, and dried the paint to see what they would look like. Which one would you have chosen for this hutch? While we ruminated on the paint color, Taylor scuff sanded the hutch with 220 grit sanding screens and medium plus foam pads on the surf prep sander to help the paint and primer stick to the surface the best it can. Then he removed the dust with our vacuum hose and then wiped it down with a tack rock. I am so thankful he is willing to do all of the boring parts of painting for me. Since this cabinet is oak with deep wood grain, I opted to roll the primer onto the cabinet to push it into the wood grain and to help prevent orange stains from coming through the paint. The whole primer situation was crazy though. I tried to tint the bin shellac primer and sat at Home Depot for about an hour with the kids running around while the paint techs tried the best they could do to tint it. They weren't very successful though, which was really unfortunate. Right from the get-go, it was so weird. Eventually, I realized that the tint never mixed in completely, and there were specks of tint all throughout the can. So in the can, the primer looked white, but when I rolled it on, it had spots all over and started to look more brown, like they tried to tint it to. Nervous about the primer's durability, I switched over to non-tinted bin shellac primer for the rest of the cabinet. I really wanted to go with the tinted primer so I wouldn't have to paint as many coats of paint over it to get full coverage, but that tinted primer was a no-go. About an hour later, I scratched at the tinted weird primer and it was really durable. So, against my better judgment, I gave the tinted primer another try. But the tint was leaving a lot of texture behind and it was weird. So I switched back to the regular primer. Now, I'm not really sure what to do with this tinted primer. Do I take it back to the store because it didn't work, even though I've used part of it? The next day, I convinced Taylor to sand the primer smooth for me. He used 400 grit sanding screens and very fine foam pads to sand the primer, to mostly avoid sanding through the primer and back to the wood surface. Look how satisfying it is to sand with those foam pads. They get into all the curves so well and much easier than regular sandpaper. Once again, he vacuumed up the dust and wiped everything down with a tack cloth to remove all of the dust. There were some places he sanded through the primer, so he spot primed them with clear shellac to make sure those areas didn't let stains come through the paint. We let that primer dry for about an hour or so while I mixed up the paint. For For the paint color, I chose the mixture of 1/3 Klein blue, 1/3 China blue, and 1/3 driftwood. Some of this paint is old, so I poured it into a paint filter to grab all of the dried paint and prevent it from being on my Hutch project. I also even used a measuring cup to measure out equal amounts of paint. Then I brushed and rolled the General Finishes milk paint onto the backs of the cabinet doors. This way they could dry first and I could get another coat of them on sooner and be able to flip them over to paint the other side within the day. I used a mohair roller and the Country Chic paint oval brush to apply the paint to get a very, very smooth finish. Once the outside was painted, I loved the look of the lighter paint color on the inside of the Hutch, so I didn't paint the blue on the inside. I grabbed some light beigey gray paint to paint inside. This Farmhouse Paint in the color pumice stone is what I had on hand, and I love the contrast it created. Farmhouse Paint is very similar to General Finishes milk paint. It self-levels very well and is very easy to brush on. I used a Klingon brush to apply the paint, and the brush just glided on. I was careful to not paint on the blue paint and let it all dry. On the tricky places, I used the yellow delicate frog tape to tape off the blue paint so I wouldn't ruin the paint it was taped on. And I could paint the other color without getting paint where I shouldn't. Removing the tape was the most satisfying part of this whole process. As I painted the second coat of paint inside the cabinet, I realized I made a big mistake. The shelf that I started to paint blue was not supposed to be blue. So I had to paint over the blue with the light grayish paint. Thankfully though, that Farmhouse Paint has great coverage and it took just 2 coats to cover up the blue. The next day I put the Hutch together because I had to get photos for a deadline. Thankfully, the doors went back on properly, thanks in part to all of my labeling. Don't worry though, I went back and I sprayed a few coats of top coat on the Hutch afterward, so this paint will be as durable as possible. So here's what it looked like before, and here's what it looks like now. The color is a little brighter than I expected, but I love it. I think it will be such a fun pop of color without being too much in your face for whoever ends up with it. What do you think of the light interior against the blue exterior? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons if you like this video. It helps push our videos out to more people who might enjoy it as well. So thank you so much. Want to turn your hobby into cash? Click the link in my comments to download the free pricing guide that we use to buy and sell furniture.